Heroes and villains. This is an incredibly common trope within storytelling. But what happens when this trope is applied to real life, real people, and real history? My name is Jackson Estes, and this is what I explored in this past trimester. Last year, in AP Latin, I read Caesar's text for the first time and was impressed by his masterful construction of the language to push his agenda. This year, I pursued a study of his text where I translated, analyzed, and then compared his work to a more modern example in the Vietnam War. In the first century BCE, Julius Caesar was a rising power in Europe. Often he is remembered for his victories on the battlefield or his exploits as a politician, but just as important to his career was his skills as a writer. Throughout his wars, he wrote commentaries, which are meant to be just short reports from the front line, but Caesar filled his writing with propaganda meant to push his agenda. Two of the main tactics he used in his propaganda were diction, the art of choosing words, and verb voice, the difference between active verbs and passive verbs. Diction is the careful choice of words. Let's look at an example. They are a good person. After hearing this sentence, our first thought is referring to a decent human being. But if we change it to they are an amazing person, the meaning changes the sentence. Now, they are an exemplary human being. You see how just one word can totally change the meaning of a sentence. This is what Caesar uses. He's a master of this. Caesar carefully chooses adjectives to describe his villains in Book 1, Chapter 31 of the De Bello Gallico, when he's describing the German king Ariovistus. He uses adjectives like superbe, crudeliter, and barbarum, iracundum, and temerarium. This choice of adjectives feeds into the stereotype of Germanic people held by the Romans, that they were arrogant, cruel, barbaric, and rash. The Germans, contrary to what Caesar wants you to believe, were people with their own motivations and own ideas and own culture, not like what Caesar and the Romans will have you believe about their stereotypes. Now, in contrast, when Caesar talks about himself, the hero of the story, he uses a polysyndeton of his accomplishments. Polysyndeton is the use of more conjunctions than necessary. So, as you can see here, he uses well a bunch of times to show all of the things that he's known for and exaggerate them by that and draw eyes to them. So he flaunts his authority with you and he says auctorite sua. He flaunts his recent victories in the region, and then he brings in the name of the Roman people, nomine populi Romani, to make the people feel involved and like the war is for the common good and not just his good. A more recent example of this same tactic is found during the Vietnam War in President Lyndon B. Johnson's address after the Tet Offensive of the Vietnam War. He states, "It did not collapse the elected government of South Vietnam or shatter its army as the communists hoped." Here we see the choice of words that will appeal to the American people and draw sympathy. We're meant to root for the elected government and against the communists. It's a common tactic. Another tool that Caesar uses is verb voice, or the difference between active voice and passive voice. An example of this is, I wrote this speech. This is an active sentence, and it's very clear who is doing the action. I'm doing the action. I wrote the speech. But if we change it to, this speech was written, then now it's unclear who actually wrote the speech because we just know that it was written. So as you can see here, there's a big deflection of the subject. We don't know what the subject is. So this simple difference can entirely change the effect of a sentence. So in the DBG, this example, he says, instead of saying, we are not able to sustain his rule any longer, he says, his rule, as in Ariovistus' rule, cannot be sustained any longer. So this simple difference transfers all the blame to the Germans because he does not blame the Gauls for not being able to sustain the German rule. He simply says that it is unable to be sustained. And this only makes the Germans seem more cruel, barbaric, and intolerable. Again, the same tactic is seen in Vietnam. He says, if peace does not come now through negotiations, it will come when Hanoi understands that our common resolve is unshakable and our common strength is invincible. So he uses the passive here, if peace does not come, versus the active, if we do not make peace, to transfer the burden of making peace onto the Vietnamese and not the Americans by saying, he's not saying that it might be our fault that we don't make peace. He's saying it's their fault if peace does not come. In Caesar's time, he relied on these commentaries to push his message back to the people. And then during the Vietnam War, Johnson relied on television to push his. But regardless of their different time periods, they both used these same tactics, even when their contact with everyday person in their country was very limited. Now, in an age of social media, where fake news is spread all over the place and propaganda is everywhere, it is important to be discerning of these tactics when we consume news.